Hello, and welcome to today's SSP webinar, Publishing Services Vendor Integration, the fourth and final in our 2014 series. We're very pleased that you can join us today. I'm Gerald Olean with Allen Press, and your organizer for SSP's webinar program. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping items to cover. We did have some technical glitches with the platform right at the beginning of the broadcast, so I'll skip down to how to communicate with us. Use the text chat feature set to organizers and panelists only, and please let us know if you're having any technical audio or video problems. Your phone has been muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. To send in questions or to notify us that you are having technical difficulties, use that text chat feature I just mentioned to organizers and panelists. When you do this with questions, please specify to which presenter you would like your question directed. Questions can be sent at any time, but we will wait till the end and present them to the panelists once all prepared presentations are completed. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you will receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You will also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar and to the slides. Our moderator today is Marianne Baines. Marianne is the Sales Director with Synveo Publisher Services. She's a successful sales and marketing executive with more than 20 years of experience in publishing, technical, and web-based services. She's worked across the entire publishing services spectrum, from development and editorial to composition and conversion to e-commerce and mobile and to printing and distribution. It's now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Marianne so she can introduce our panel and get us underway. Marianne?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Gerald. I appreciate it, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Our first speaker will be Charlotte McNaughton. Charlotte is currently the Director of Publishing Technologies for the American Society of Civil Engineers. Over a 30-year career, she's worked with all types of vendors, ranging from freelancer vendors for things such as copy editing, indexing, and graphic design, to large vendors for things such as composition, printing of journals, books, and magazines, and online platforms. Other projects that Charlotte has worked on have included taxonomy development, user experience testing, and website design. On the vendor side, she co-founded a small type house in the 1980s and still owns X-Acto knives, a T-square, a waxer, and other artifacts of a bygone era of print production. So, Charlotte, we really appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to learning from your experiences. I'll now turn it over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Marianne. Hi, I'm Charlotte McNaughton with the American Society of Civil Engineers. As mentioned in the introduction, I've bought just about everything you can buy in this space and learned a lot of these lessons the hard way. It is from that perspective that I will talk about relationships between publishers and vendors. Once a connection is made, all parties want the relationship to work. What does it take to succeed? As in your personal life, you need to find the right partner. This requires knowing what you need. Sarah has some insights on that point in the next presentation. But consider, if a printer does a bad job on one book, there are lots of other book printers out there. Changing journal compositor or magazine printer or online platform is challenging, expensive, and time-consuming. It pays in the long run to maintain a smooth working situation. You can leave the blah, blah, blah boilerplate to your legal counsel, but whoever is managing large and long-running projects needs to know what the end game is if you need to leave the relationship. A major point. Make sure the contract clarifies who owns the data or content. In theory, the publisher owns it, but if a technology company has done some processing, they may take the position that they own the most enhanced version of the data. What would trigger an export of the data, and in what format? Also, know the renewal and cancellation terms. You don't want to be stuck for another year or 3 in a bad situation because you failed to give timely notice. Reputable vendors will cooperate in an orderly transition, but if the relationship is broken for other reasons, you don't want to have to rely on the other party to be nice. Cash flow is important to all businesses. Paying your bills on time is not only a matter of respect for the business aspect of the relationship, it is a factor a vendor will consider if you ever need a favor. Your vendors are expert at what they do. Leverage that knowledge every way you can. The request for proposal is a great time to learn about the state of the art in whatever area you are bidding on. You're not just comparing prices and services, but gaining understanding of the business climate and technological changes. Is the business stable? How do they see the future? What are your plans over the duration of the contract, and how does the vendor fit in? It's good to do this every few years, even if you have a great relationship with the vendor. And if your current vendor doesn't respond to the RFP, in effect taking you for granted, that may be a message too. There's a social aspect to these relationships. Practice small talk with your vendor counterparts about their families, hobbies, favorite movies, whatever you can find of mutual interest. Bad things happen over time. Mistakes are made. Hard conversations have to take place. Those are much easier when you have a social foundation to lighten the mood and get back on track. Also, people change jobs. A close working relationship may dissolve, but the contacts survive and may provide a connection to another company or service. Help your vendor. If they ask for a reference for a prospective client, or ask you to participate in a survey, or ask you to speak at a user group meeting, accept these opportunities if you can. In addition to building up goodwill, this may give you a special opportunity to learn more about the company or a new service. Even when you have a great vendor, don't put the blinders on. There is always more to learn. I use Google and Wikipedia a lot because new terms or technical details come up constantly. A week ago, I needed to look up active versus passive FTP. I'm not writing a dissertation on it. I just needed to know enough to move the conversation along. Where I work in the DC area, there are some local groups that bring together publishing professionals. Look for or start a similar group or meet up in your area. And don't forget your boss and in-house colleagues. Their breadth of knowledge may surprise you. A good user group meeting may include training on complex tasks, like pulling custom reports out of a database, or customer roundtables to propose and prioritize new features or services. Your social game is useful here, too. Take your business cards and look for counterparts at other organizations who are willing to chat or email about issues with your platform or vendor. After the meeting, keep in touch. You've heard location, location, location. This is communicate, communicate, communicate. Over the years, I've acquired something of a reputation for, plain speaking. Vendors sometimes tell me they appreciate this. Maybe they do, and maybe they don't. That they are seldom in doubt about what I think about an issue or what I need. And if they know, there is a chance that they will be able to help. The vendor cannot read your mind and is probably busy communicating with customers who talk to them. So make sure that they hear you. At the same time, be as gracious as you can. This can be hard when you are frustrated, but your vendor counterparts are seldom the ultimate decision makers. They are tasked with delivering sometimes unpleasant news, and they may be frustrated as well if things are not working as they should. You need their cooperation and their advocacy. Use the magic words please and thank you frequently, especially thank you. Give them a chance to do their jobs before you escalate an issue over their heads. Be clear and be nice. Listen to your vendors. In addition to advice on projects and workflows, you may sometimes need to read between the lines of what they are telling you and what they mean. For example, if you ask for an enhancement or extra service and they provide an exorbitant estimate or a long schedule, it may mean that they do not understand the request, which creates an opportunity to explore an issue more deeply. Or it may mean that they don't want to do what you are asking, assuming they will do it at all. This can be painful, especially if you don't have other options for getting certain kinds of development work done. You may need to figure out what plan B will be, whether you can do without the enhancement, or whether there is another way to accomplish your goal. or whether some escalation needs to happen to convince them to do what you need done. Did I mention the ticket system? If your vendor has one, use it. Monitor status, update, prioritize. Sarah's chuckling over this one. It was her mantra at a previous job, and she has changed my attitude and behavior on tickets. And a note to vendors: archive the tickets and make them searchable. There's no point in writing everything down if you can never find it again. Quality control is the publisher's problem, no matter what is in the contract about who does what. It is the publisher's name on the documents and the websites, and the publisher's relationship with authors and their readers that is at stake. Check everything. And when the book or issue is printed, or there is a website redeployment, check it again. The vendor will have a point person, maybe a sales rep or an account manager, who is assigned to interact with the customer. The publisher needs to have this too, clarity about who talks to the vendor and who makes the call when an issue arises. On the publisher's side, make sure that everyone who works on a project knows who speaks for the publisher. You don't want to confuse a vendor and slow down a project. Sarah has some excellent detail on this. Stay tuned. Okay. Apparently there are several vendor representatives listening to this webinar, and this slide is for them. It may be up to the vendor to decide how their work will be done, but the customer needs to know enough to appropriately manage quality and other relationships that may intersect with the vendor. Reports are crucial for monitoring performance and may provide early warning of problems or clues about solutions to problems. Publishers may support or develop industry standards, but they cannot implement them without the technical support of their vendors. In our complex publishing world, we simply have to work together. Ultimately, good relationships are everyone's responsibility. Sailing is better than sinking. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Charlotte. That was a really great overview, so thank you for that. As a quick reminder, we will be taking the questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to type your questions into the system whenever you choose, and then I will read them all at the end. All right, next we will be hearing from Sarah Zimmerman. Sarah is the Assistant Director for Online Publishing at the Radiological Society of North America, or RSNA. Sarah began her career at the University of Chicago Press, where she was a part of the team that made the Astrophysical Journal, one of the first journals to be published online. And prior to joining RSNA, she was the manager of client services at the vendor Adipon, where she oversaw support and content services and participated in numerous journal and book migration and implementation projects. So she has a wealth of experience and has seen the wonderful world of client-vendor relations from both sides. So thank you for joining us, Sarah. We're looking forward to hearing from your dual experiences. I'll pass it over to you.
Hi there. So I'll be picking up where Charlotte left off, and I'm going to be talking about making transitions with vendors. I'll spend most of my time talking specifically about hosting providers, since that's my area of expertise, and it's a key component of publishers' business that's often outsourced these days. But even if changing providers is not something you're considering in the short term, at least some of what I have to say will apply more generally to your relationships with vendors, especially technology providers. So first off, why do publishers outsource? A first reason is lack of in-house resources to do whatever it is you need to do. Where online publishing is concerned, it can be hard to attract the talent you need in our sector, given how in-demand people with technology skills are these days. Even if you do have the resources to do it, there's a large cost to keeping up with new business needs and standards. Just keeping up with something like meeting new counter-compliance standards for reporting comes at a cost, and generally it's much easier to let a vendor worry about that, about keeping that current for you. A big component of the costs of hosting yourself is maintaining the hardware infrastructure, taking care of backups, keeping the hardware patched and up to date, doing all of the administration. That the costs on that are generally lower if you outsource. And in any event, the bottom line is that outsourcing generally means lower costs. So what do you need to consider when selecting a hosting provider? So Charlotte covered this in a general way, but I want to highlight a few things here specific to journal hosting, to publication hosting. First, look at how many existing clients the vendor has, how many people are they hosting, and are the people they're hosting like you? Are they similar organizations? For example, if you have a large book program and need a host for that content, does the vendor have a robust book platform, or are they really only serving journal publishers? As Charlotte said, talk to references. That's going to be the best way for you to find out what the strengths and weaknesses of each vendor are. Do a feature comparison. Do they offer all the features you need and ones you know you're going to want in the near future? And look at what they actually have in production, not just what you're being told they can do in the sales pitch. Where pricing is concerned, find out how new features and development are going to be priced so you can understand what your off-contract costs are going to be. A vendor might be low on its annual fees, but because of the way they price development, you'll end up with more costs for change requests and new features, so that's something to look at. Very importantly, how full service a vendor do you need? In the online hosting environment, that means things like how much control do you want over content production and other material you publish on your website? Do you want a lot of control, or do you want the vendor to do most of that for you? Another example, do you need the vendor to do end user support for your website? There's a lot of care and feeding that goes on to maintaining a platform. Do you have a customer service team to do that, or do you need the vendor to do that? Finally, how much customization and systems integration are you going to need? Do you have a subscription fulfillment system, for instance, that you need to integrate with, and you're going to need the vendor to do a custom workflow for you? The answers to all of these questions are going to be things that inform who's the right fit for you. Once you've made the decision of who you're going to work with, start preparing as soon as you can for the challenges you're going to meet when you make a transition like this. They're going to be generally the same for every organization, but a few things may vary depending on your situation. First, you may be moving from an in-house platform. If that's your situation, be prepared for resistance from the owners of your in-house platform. The team that built your platform is going to be protective of it. They may not have been involved or completely on board with the decision to outsource, and there may be anxiety about what the move is going to mean for their jobs. So be sensitive to that and involve the team in what's happening so they feel a part of it and you get their buy-in to make the transition successful. Prepare everybody in the organization for a general loss of control. The upside of having an in-house platform is you have more control over what gets implemented and when. Moving a process or platform out that was previously in-house is going to mean changing how you work. You're going to have to spec things more explicitly, learn to communicate with remote teams that are outside of your organization, and get used to not having complete control over when things happen and how they happen. Finally, you may run into some trouble with your content migration because of shortcomings in your XML that you've worked around on your platform. The upside of having complete control is you can work around those shortcomings in the code. The downside is you have to document and deal with all those hacks you did when you set things up on your own platform, when you migrate the content, and you may not even remember what you did in the first place. You know, the people who did the work may be gone. Probably the more common case for the people listening today is that you're moving from one provider to another. If that's your situation, when you decide to change vendors, first off, take a look at the contract with your current provider. Are the migration costs spelled out there? If not, get clarification from the vendor up front about what those costs might be for things like getting your user data and migrating your content. Also, what happens if the migration runs over schedule? Will you be able to go month to month, or are you going to have to sign for an extension, in which case it's going to be very important that you bring the project in on time. You might run into some challenges with migration of your user data and content if you've been fairly hands-off with it and let the vendor manage a lot of it, and I'll speak a little bit more to that later. And last but not least, you're just going to have to deal with good old resistance to change. People get used to doing things a certain way, and they're going to have to make at least modest changes to how they work when you make any kind of vendor transition. So there are some of the challenges. What can you do as an organization to successfully get the project done? Tight project management is going to be key to launching on time, so make sure you designate a project manager on your side. The vendor you work with will, or at least should, have a project manager on their team, but I can't stress enough how important it is to tightly manage the project on the client side as well. The person you designate doesn't have to be a dedicated project manager. They can be a team lead. In fact, that's often better since they'll be closer to the work. And make sure whoever that person is empowered to be the final arbiter when there are key decisions to be made along the way, or at least that they have direct access to the person who can do that, so you aren't bogged down in the decision-making process. Next, make friends with your IT department. This goes double if you're moving something in-house to a vendor, but if your hosting platform is already outsourced, you're still going to need your IT staff to provide technical expertise and advice, and to supply data from in-house systems, so make sure you're including them in the process. Consider up front how you're going to staff the transition. How many people you're going to need is going to vary depending on your size and the scope of what you're doing, but staff from every area of your publications department will be involved. Production for managing the content deliverables, editorial for QA, marketing, and your subscription fulfillment folks for customer communication and user migration. Staffing is easier if you have an in-house platform you're migrating from, because then you can reassign those staff to work on the transition. But either way, unless you're in a position financially to hire a team just to manage the conversion, you're going to be asking your staff to do a lot of extra work on top of the regular responsibilities. So it's important to try to motivate them and get them to take ownership in the endeavor. And just remember, it's always going to turn out to be a lot more work than you expect it to be. So there's kind of three parts to a migration. I'm going to start speaking briefly about UI development. Here my main suggestion is to make sure you start the design process early. UI development can end up taking a lot of time, especially if you have a lot of stakeholders who have to come to a consensus about the design. And make sure you involve those stakeholders along the way. Don't keep everything under wraps and then unveil it late in the process when it's too late to change anything. Conversely, you have to be careful about the too many cooks problem. You can put 30 people in a room and you can get 30 different opinions about a design, so you're going to need to find a balance there. In all the decisions you make about UI, let user analytics guide you where you have them. This is important to look at, in particular with custom features on your site that your new vendor might not support. If no one's using the feature, you want to look at whether you really need to migrate it. The next component is your access and your subscription access data and other user data. My advice here is to use the migration as an opportunity to audit and clean it up, remove things like inactive or duplicate accounts while you're doing the migration. Oftentimes the data migration gets put off until the last minute because it's tedious, but this is a golden opportunity to scrub your data, which may not be that clean, especially if it's been a long time since you migrated it from one system to another, or if you've never migrated it anywhere at all. And the last part of the migration is migrating all of your content, all your digital assets. No matter where your content is hosted now and what DTD it's in, there's going to be some degree of conversion work necessary to go from one platform to another, since requirements for rendering vary from platform to platform. First off, know your XML and know what its problems are. I say this whether you intend to convert the content yourself or have a vendor do it. Even if you're using a vendor and they're going to be pretty hands-off with it, your vendor's not going to know where the problems are unless you tell them. As with your user data, use this as an opportunity to clean things up. Where your content markup isn't regular, regularize it during the conversion. Get it all onto the most recent version of your selected XML DTD, even if the vendor could take multiple DTDs. And keep a local archive. If you don't have a local archive of all your digital assets, especially if you're not participating in an archiving initiative like Portico or anywhere else, get a copy when you move. Even if you're not moving, get a copy. There's no guarantee that your hosting provider is going to be there in 10 years, so don't use them as a content archive, because that's not what they are. And finally, don't forget you're going to need to identify staff to do quality assurance. Unless you have a very small amount of content, you're not going to be able to QA every single article and issue. So instead, approach it by creating a stratified sample, by which I mean selecting issues from a range of years based on some criteria that makes sense for you. For instance, your sample set might be content from years where you were PDF only and then years where you went to full text, or the breakdown might be when you changed XML suppliers or made a change to a platform previously. So that's what will go into doing your migration. Now, a few words on how to meet your schedule. Obviously, you're going to be dependent on the vendor's schedule and what kind of timeline they can deliver on, and you could do a whole additional presentation on project management for this kind of thing at a publisher. But there are two key things that you can do to help make your launch date that I want to mention here, both of which basically come down to ruthless pragmatism. First, be prepared to descope features. Here I'll come back to my earlier comment that these projects always turn out to be more work than you think they're going to be. There will likely be something you need to defer until after launch, so when you enter roughly the last third of the project, take a look at where you are and start sorting what is core functionality that you can't launch without and what could be implemented after launch, and talk that through with your vendor. Second, avoid unnecessary customization where you can. There's often more than one way to meet a requirement. I think Charlotte touched on this too. So be open with working with what the vendor can already provide when you can. It'll save you money and it'll help you meet your schedule. And in anticipation of launch, consider how you're going to manage change. Be prepared for negative reactions within your organization and from users. People don't like change, so just the simple fact that you're changing vendors is going to cause some amount of negative reaction. The best way to handle that is to have a story. Develop a narrative that clearly explains why you made the key decisions you made along the way. Hopefully you've been doing this from the very beginning when you made the decision to make a transition. For instance, if you've decided to drop a feature because it wasn't being used, go back to the user analytics and show people why you dropped it, because what the data was telling you. Also be sure to identify and highlight the benefits of the move to the new vendor so the stakeholders understand exactly what all the fuss and extra work was about. And if you can point to increased efficiency and cost reduction, be sure to emphasize that. Everybody likes that. So now that you've survived your transition, what can you do to ensure success moving forward? I'm going to move quickly here because my co-presenters are covering this territory as well. But I want to emphasize the following. Make sure you're communicating your business priorities and deadlines clearly to your vendor. It may seem really obvious to you what needs to be at the top of your priority list, but it may not always be obvious to the vendor. Understand what is expected of you as a client and make sure your staff are trained. It's a really good idea when dealing with hosting platforms or any piece of technology that you bought to have designated power users in-house who can act as resources for your staff. It'll save you a lot of back and forth with the vendor. And make sure you write things down. Keep a paper trail of key decisions and discussions along the way. You'll need it if there are ever any issues. On the other side of the equation, I second everything that Charlotte had on her slides about what vendors can do, and will distill my remarks to a few things. First, open and honest communication is a key. You know, your existing clients don't want a sales pitch. They just want good and consistent service and transparency about what you can do for them and when and how much it's going to cost. Internally, make sure your client services staff are empowered to get things done for their clients and that there's good communication between product management at the vendor and the people who work directly with the clients. And this is a really obvious point, but make sure you're providing good training for your staff and for your clients. Make sure the client services staff you're putting in front of people know what your product can do, understand the services you offer, know the industry, can efficiently solve your problems, and can offer advice. Make sure you're giving your clients enough training and have good documentation. It's not really a good use of anyone's time for your support staff to be answering clients' basic questions about how to use your product. Finally, educate your clients about your processes and how you work. That includes things like how to do the project management, how to set priorities on the client side, and also things as basic as how to write a good bug report. And even with all of that, sometimes things are going to go wrong. If you do need to escalate something, as a client. First of all, read and understand your service level agreement and take an objective view of the severity of the problem. When you have your editor-in-chief breathing down your neck about something, that's not always easy to do, but a good vendor will have laid out clearly in your contract what you can expect in terms of problem resolution times, and you can use that to set expectations within your organization about how quickly things are going to happen. Also, pick your battles and don't escalate everything, and you're not going to be taken very seriously when you really do need to escalate. Next, be specific. Keep that paper trail I mentioned earlier. The person you're escalating to is going to be at a remove from the situation and may not know every detail of what's happened, and it's just good to have that record there. And I didn't put this obvious dictum on the slides, but be polite. You're dealing with human beings, and creating a contentious relationship isn't going to make anything go smoother. And what should vendors do? Well, first off, provide good service so no one can complain, but when matters do arise, make sure your clients know who to escalate to if their relationship manager is unavailable, or if their relationship manager is the problem, which can be the case. When something does go less than ideally, stay ahead of the problem when you can and be honest what happened and why. There's no point in trying to talk around something. And finally, communicate clearly and with specifics about what you plan to do to correct things and keep them on track in the future. And with that, I will turn things over to the next speaker.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That was great information. I know you're coming from the hosting side, but that was really, a lot of that was very, very relevant across a lot of different vendor services, so that was great. All right, next we will be hearing from Jennifer Passanelli. Jennifer is the Deputy Executive Director for Operations and the Director of Publications for the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, or FASEB. She's been with FASEB since 1997, and she directs the publication operations for the FASEB Journal. In addition, Jennifer works with several FASEB member and client societies on their publishing programs and supports them in efforts ranging from vendor selection and contract negotiation to editorial policy and business model changes. In her role for operations, she oversees the association management services business lines at FASEB and functions as a vendor to more than 40 scientific organizations by providing services ranging from contracts, membership, and accounting services. So thank you, Jennifer, for joining us, and we appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us, and I will now turn it over with you.
Folks, we have an audio problem with Jennifer. She should be with us momentarily.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you now. Great.
Thank you. I apologize for the delay. Too many buttons. And thank you very much, Marianne, for the introduction. While Sarah provided great detail from the publisher perspective and went into detail on the platform selection and migration, I'd like to take a step back and highlight some of the key ideas mentioned by both Charlotte and Sarah from a bit more of the vendor's perspective. As Marianne mentioned in my bio, in my current role with FASEB, I work from both a vendor and a client perspective. On the vendor side, I run FASEB's Association Management Services business line. We provide full service management for scientific societies ranging everywhere from providing executive directors and business managers to societies through managing their meetings and all of the support services including membership, accounting, and IT. We also provide publication services and manage journal programs for various societies. But to be clear, we don't provide any systems such as peer review or platforms. But we do contract for these systems on behalf of the societies we manage and for our own publications programs as well. So since we contract for systems for both societies we manage and for our own programs, I have the benefit of the client perspective as well. We did an extensive RFP for our association management system, and because of this and client work, I've been through 2 migrations in the past 6 years. So even though Sarah was speaking about platform migration specifically, the comments that she made, and especially her recommendations under her Getting It Done section, were spot on for pretty much any kind of migration. Specifically in terms of publishing, I have the client perspective in terms of working with various peer review systems, composition and printing vendors, and commercial publishers, as well as different platforms. So what I'd like to highlight are some of the ideas that Charlotte and Sarah mentioned, but focus my experience as a vendor to round out the perspectives that my colleagues already shared. And I'd like to go back to the beginning and suggest that the entire tone of the relationship between the vendor and a client can be set at the RFP stage. Actually spending time developing a solid RFP is not only beneficial to ease the process, but it really is your best bet as a publisher to compare apples to apples. Let's say you're interested in a new peer review system. Every peer review vendor will be happy to provide you with proposals and demonstrations, but unless you have a well-developed RFP to ensure you're asking the same thing of each vendor, you'll be very challenged to know whether or not a particular vendor can really meet your needs. Writing a solid RFP is time-consuming, and sometimes if you're entrenched in a particular workflow, it's also challenging for you to take a step back and see the big picture and think, what else could I be asking in proposals? While it isn't always necessary or feasible, if possible, I'd recommend you consider engaging a consultant to bring a fresh perspective or an outside look to the process. I know that when we use consultants for different RFP processes, they will really add a layer to the conversation between us and the vendor or the client in terms of providing additional feedback and things that we might not have thought of from either side. But whether you work with a consultant or develop an RFP in-house, the more detailed you can develop the RFP, the better. So while it's important to provide vendors with background of who you are and what you need, the scope of services or your absolute minimum requirements of what you need is critical in order for vendors to appropriately propose a solution and meet your needs. It's also very important to detail what you expect in terms of processes from the RFP in terms of the proposal and what timelines you need to meet. And I'm going to pause right there because I see that some people are having problems seeing my full screen. I want to ask Kellen if there's advice on that, because the only thing I see on my screen is my slides.
Unmuted.
Why don't you try to maybe go from, take it off of full screen and then put it back on full screen and see if that kind of fixes it.
Has that helped?
No, it doesn't look like it has.
Jennifer, in the upper right corner, do you have a full screen button of that slide once you're in slide mode? The little box up on the right to the left of the X.
Yeah.
Just go to start your slides. And then can you click on that box up at the top to view and feel full screen mode? No.
No, I have no box.
I don't know the solution. Gerald, any advice here? I recommend we just continue. We can make the slides available after the fact. Jennifer, I would just proceed at this point.
Can you see my slides at all?
I can, but they are cut off.
Okay. Okay, well, I apologize to that, and I certainly apologize to all our attendees as well. We had a practice for a reason, but obviously I failed in a bit of the practice as well. But I will continue. So I was just mentioning the importance of the RFP. But then moving on to the proposal stage. So once you've issued your RFP, from the vendor's perspective, I'll say please be open to questions. The better the vendors can understand your needs and your specific projects and workflow, the better the vendors will be able to provide a solution to actually meet your needs rather than simply showcase their abilities. And the more successful the entire process will be for everyone. So a good proposal from a vendor will include the scope of services from the vendor's perspective rather than simply a reiteration of what you've provided in your needs assessment. You want to be sure that the vendor actually understands what you truly need rather than simply have them provide a summary of what their system and platform can do. So this could mean a lot of discussions back and forth. As you're writing down what you need and the vendors are proposing their solutions, you want to make sure that you're using the same terminology and having conversations to make sure that everybody is of the same understanding. And throughout this process, expectations are critical. As my colleagues mentioned before, expectations are super important. And what do you expect and need and want from the vendor? And do you understand what the vendor is expecting, needing, and wanting from you? Time and time again, I find it necessary to check in with our clients and make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what we intend to provide and what we think they are expecting from us. And when expectations fall out of alignment, that's kind of the recipe for disaster. So publishers should expect their vendors to be very clear about the deliverables, and vendors should make sure they're on the same page as the publishers. And as a vendor, if I can't provide 100% of what a publisher is requesting, I need to be absolutely clear if there's third-party involvement, say for metrics or reporting or some enhanced feature. And as a vendor, I need to make sure that the publisher is aware of any third-party relationships and what, if any, costs or other responsibilities the publisher will bear as a result, and whether or not there are other impacts such as on the timeline or the expectations with the other vendor involvement. So I note that a critical phase is the proposal to contract phase, but if the RFP and proposal phase have gone well, the contract phase should be greatly simplified. The scope of services of what was agreed upon during the proposal phase should be transformed into the scope of services within a contract. And a bit of advice, if you, the publisher, don't see the same information you saw in the contract that you saw agreed upon in the proposal phase, ask the vendor to include the scope as an appendix to the contract. You want the same level of detail, if not more, in the contract. And quite often, this is not what you see. If it isn't included and problems arise down the line, it could be too late to go back. A quick point about the negotiation phase, always have an exit strategy, meaning never negotiate without a plan B. If you don't like the terms of a vendor contract or the timing isn't what you expected, make sure you leave yourself an out with another vendor or a current process or something so you just don't find yourself painted into a corner and forced to accept a contract that is less than what you need. Sarah covered the transition phase very thoroughly, so I'll only note that transition is a huge step and documentation is critical from both sides. Make sure you understand what the vendor is doing and make sure the vendor is aware of what you need and expect throughout the entire phase. And once you've conquered the transition, both sides hope to move into a steady state, but neither side should become complacent or neglect the relationship. My colleagues already mentioned the importance of communication, but it certainly bears repeating. If you aren't happy, say something. And likewise to the vendors participating in this webinar, I say communication is a two-way street. Both parties are responsible for communicating their needs if any problems arise. And this goes back to expectations. It's very important that you try and define expectations from both sides early on, but it's critical that you continue to maintain open communication around expectations. Things change, staff, technology, and your needs. And neither the vendors nor the publishers are mind readers, as Sarah said. So it's really important to have check-ins with each other and make sure you're both still on the same page. As for my comment, you aren't the only one. Many vendors, I know us included, endeavor to entreat each client as if you're our only client in the world. But the reality is you know that isn't true, and we know that isn't true. So we all need to be honest about requests and anticipated turnaround times for getting things done. And at the same time, vendors need respect and acknowledgement from the publisher that you aren't the only client we are working with and we all have limited resources. So as long as both parties are open and honest about needs and abilities and expectations, everybody should get along just fine. But in the event that doesn't happen and problems do arise, Sarah provided some good advice for how and when to escalate concerns. One item that we haven't really covered in this seminar is multiple vendor integration. I know some societies are integrating their manuscript tracking systems with their membership systems. They want to know which authors or members are members or maybe which authors aren't members and to be able to reach out to these constituents appropriately. And as a publisher, you want to integrate multiple systems such as your peer review with your association management system. It can be pretty tricky. While quite often it can be accomplished with an application programming interface or API, the solutions are often more technical than in-house journal staff is used to. And my recommendation would be to let your vendors talk to each other, but always have the staff project lead involved. You don't want to be in a situation where your vendors have worked out a solution that, unbeknownst to you, will cost you thousands of dollars in development time. And the staff project lead should be on every call and be able to request and receive documentation and estimates at every step in the process. If your vendors won't provide that, consider finding other vendors. At the same time, you should expect there will be costs involved, quite likely from both vendors. And this should be something you should consider and be prepared for very early on if this is a goal of your project. You'll need to be prepared to account for 2 vendors' timelines instead of just one in order to get the job done. And again, communication is key. You need to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So in closing, I would just like to say that at the end of the day, from both a vendor and the publisher perspective, the desired result is truly like apple pie a la mode. Vendors and publishers are very different, but given the right opportunities, expectation, and communication, they have the opportunity to go very, very well together.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very, very much, Jennifer. That was great. We appreciate it. And again, thank you to all of our speakers. We certainly appreciate you guys sharing your knowledge and experience. And we're now going to move into the question and answer period. So if anybody else has any questions, feel free to send them in to me now. I'll start with the questions that we have. First, Jennifer, this question was for you, but if anybody else can answer this as well, that's fine. What type of consultant would one look for to help with an RFP? And do you have any suggestions for finding a reliable consultant?
Well, I think there's a lot of different kinds of consultants that are available. Certainly SSP is probably a resource for that. There's a lot of consultants that are members. And if you talk to different people at SSP, on the board or committees that you're aware of, they can probably help and share those with you. I can also be happy to share them with you offline. Different consultants have different areas of expertise, so sometimes it's good to ask them, say, if you are thinking about a manuscript submission system, certain consultants will have more expertise, and then you might want to get a few proposals from different ones to see which one of those might best fit your organizational style and work with you well.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was muted, and here I was having a conversation. Sorry, everybody. Let's go to the next question. What is the main criteria that you use when choosing vendors, would you say? And Jennifer, let's start with you, and then we'll also get Sarah and Charlotte's input on that as well.
It really depends on the project. So one of my main criteria would be actually the vendor's reputation and their skills and ability at providing whatever service or product or project that we're looking at. So price is not at the top of my list. It's certainly a factor, but really their expertise is my #1 factor.
Okay, that's great. And how about Sarah? How about for you?
I would say the same on that. Talk to other people in the industry, hear who they're using, what their experiences with them are, and yeah, I think the reputation is more important than price.
Okay, and Charlotte?
Yes, I would agree with everything that's been said so far. The point that I believe Sarah made about does this vendor do the kind of work for other people that you are asking them to do, and what are those customers' experience with that vendor, that reputation is critical and probably the single most important thing that we would use as a decision-making factor.
Okay. All right, and another question, let's see. I've got a question from one of the attendees, and it is, where is a good place or group to seek potential vendors for hosting, migrating scholarly journals? This person is new to the field and needs some good starting points to locate some quality vendors.
Well, there aren't very many in the space, so it's pretty easy to find out who those people are. And I think talk to anybody who is currently on a platform, and you'll get an earful both about the vendor that they've selected and pretty much about their opinion of anybody else who's in the space. I don't think any of us probably wish to have those conversations publicly, but I think that offline you can get quite a bit of information by talking to your peers.
Okay. All right. I think that makes a lot of sense, talking to your peers. How about Jennifer or Sarah? Do you guys have anything else to add to that one?
I think that's a spot-on answer. You know, there's a lot of publishers out there, so just talk to them and see what kind of feedback you get.
All right. Well, that kind of brings up, you just mentioned that a lot of them are offshore. How do you decide whether to go with an offshore vendor versus an onshore vendor, and are there specific questions or things that should be asked when deciding between the two? And Jennifer, let's start with you. Any thoughts on that?
Really, then, I mean, I would make sure that communication is going to be something that's a key to focus on, and just talking about, you know, what time zones and things people operate in, and whether or not you can connect and have good relationship that way. Because if you can't work out the communication issue to begin with, you'll be stepping off on the wrong foot.
Right. And how about Sarah or Charlotte?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, to some degree, it just doesn't matter anymore. Even if your supplier is in the U.S., you're going to be dealing with them remotely. You're not going to see them face-to-face that much. But, yeah, certainly the time zone thing is an issue. If you are working with a vendor that's in Asia, they don't have a U.S. front house, there's going to be a very small time window when everybody's in the office at the same time. And that can make things harder.
Yes, I would add that most of the time there is a U.S. representative that is dealing with the offshore entity, and probably your communications will go through that source. So they're the ones who have to worry about time zones and language and holiday schedules and details like that. If there is no such person, then you're going to have to pay pretty close attention to that. Americans are very accustomed to their own holidays and their own schedules, and they are very insensitive to what is going on in the rest of the world. The other thing is, it does depend a little bit on what it is you're outsourcing. It may be one thing if it's programming for a platform, for instance. Programming language may be pretty standard. However, if you're purchasing copy editing or certain kinds of other quality control services, you really need to make sure that what is being done for you is what you want to have done. And that is not always obvious. Speaking English may be an international feature for a lot of businesses, but speaking English or editing it in the way that you need, that's a whole other question. So that's something you just need to look at depending on what your project is.
Okay, yeah, that brings up a great point where you know, if that communication and if you're doing offshore and you're not wanting to have to deal with a lot of the time zones and things like that, asking the question of where is your customer service rep, I think that was an excellent point to bring up. So can you guys all give an idea or kind of a sample of kind of the biggest pitfall you guys have had to overcome when dealing with vendors, just kind of as a, as an example? Don't mean to put you on the spot.
I'll jump in. I think sometimes resource issues are a huge problem. A lot of what is needed in this day and age is actually very complex, and it takes a lot of time to sort of figure out what it is and how to make it work with the systems that you have now. And some of that is stuff that you as a publisher can help with and work out, but a lot of it is really going to be very much on the vendor side. So the vendor has to have enough resources to get behind any given project, and they're pretty careful about not agreeing to do something until they can apply those resources to it. But this is where Jennifer's point about you're not the only client comes in. Everybody is clamoring for that attention, and getting on the list and using the time that you have available to you efficiently. It's not just a matter of saving you money. It's also a matter of getting it done, and getting it done in a way that allows the vendor to serve other customers as well as you at the same time.
That's great. Any other ideas from Sarah or Jennifer on that that you've had?
I'll just add that I mentioned I think the scope of services is very critical. Sometimes there is a disconnect between what you think you've asked for as a publisher and what you're being provided back, and to actually sit down with the vendor and the publisher and go through that and make sure, like I said, you're using the same terms and that you're on the same page, because sometimes you can get into a project and you can realize that you've forgotten or left out a component, or you think you had it included in there but you didn't say it in the right way that the vendor understood it, and it turns out that that's not covered, or if that's added in they can't meet the deadline. So I really think it's really important to get all that detail down.
Great. And, all right.
Yeah, so I agree with everything they just said, and I guess I would mention to the vendors on the call how important training is, and as much for your clients as for your own team, because sometimes the clients don't know what they don't know, and oftentimes the documentation they need is there for them. They just don't know where to look. So it's very important that publishers take that responsibility and make sure they have people that really understand the product and know how to use it, and that they're getting as much training as they need from the vendor. And if you don't feel like you've gotten enough training, ask for more and get them to provide that for you, because being self-sufficient is much better than having to put a ticket in a queue to do some basic thing during the day that you could do yourselves but you just don't know.
That's great. That's great. And with that, it looks like we are out of time. Again, wanted to really thank all three of you ladies for joining us and sharing your excellent knowledge. It was fantastic. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Gerald, and he's going to wrap us up.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And I think it's a little bit ironic, and I'm not trying to make light of it, that with this topic for this webinar that we actually had a lot of vendor issues that we're going to have to send in some complaint tickets on. So I think our presenters, even though they all apologized, I can assure you it was not them. We are having some platform issues as I opened up the webinar with. So thanks to you as attendees for fighting through that as well. And a reminder that the live broadcast as well as the slides themselves will be posted to the SSP website here within the next couple of days. Also, again, a reminder, please respond to the survey webinar evaluation you will receive via email. And that feedback will help us, again, to work on improving the SSP webinar program for 2015. And with that, our session and our 2014 webinar series are concluded. Enjoy the rest of your day, and look forward to joining you all again in 2015. Thanks.